Welcome to our webinar on how to move your in-person simulation workshop to online delivery. My name is Michael Bean, and in the next hour, what we're going to do is cover 3 different types of simulations that can be delivered online. One of them is a single-player turn-based simulations. Another is multiplayer that can be done semi-asynchronously, and during the webinar today, I'll explain more about what I mean by semi-asynchronous simulations. And then finally, we're going to talk about anonymous multiplayer synchronous simulations. And again, when we get to that section, I'll explain more about what an anonymous multiplayer synchronous simulation is. In addition, what I want to do is introduce more about what's sort of the call to action that we're all experiencing right now around online delivery. And then at the end, I want to talk about other considerations, sort of other tools that can support your delivery. So, we're all facing this crisis right now, and there's a lot happening with, when I wrote this slide, actually, it was widespread reductions in face-to-face workshops and learning. That has changed to widespread elimination of face-to-face learning. And, there's organizational do not congregate policies in place. And as a consequence of all of that, we have employees and students who are working from home and who are learning from home. And this introduces a challenge to facilitators. Many of you who are on the call today, who have provided in-class education your entire careers, and now all of us are scrambling to produce online versions of our workshops and classes. And it's more than just, simply publishing online content. It's, publishing online content and just making, say, PDFs available is not equivalent to engaging the learners who are going to be participating in this online content. We want, the last thing we want to do is just, deliver learning virtually, but in an ineffective way. So, what we're trying to do is engage learners in new ways and help them sort of use the tools that are available to help them better. So we need to transform our face-to-face content rapidly to provide digital education. And there's several key points of this. We don't want to focus just on delivery, but instead focus on the experience and the outcomes for the learners. And a big part of that is that experience should be collaborative for the learners. So it's collaborative with the facilitator, it's collaborative with other learners in the virtual classroom that we're going to have. And it won't look the same as when we're sitting in a room. It obviously won't be that same experience, but we can use these new tools that are available to, in some ways, make it better. And maybe a lot of ways, maybe that whole experience is a better experience than what they had when they were sitting in a classroom. And this is really an opportunity right now. It's an opportunity for facilitators and learners to use digital delivery in a new way. And we believe that simulation is a piece of this puzzle. It's a part of the delivery that can go on. And there's several things that simulations can do. It can promote discussions and debates. There's an opportunity for facilitating dialogue among learners. There's opportunities for role play. There's opportunities for group online work where there's interaction that's occurring among those learners. And also demonstrations and debriefs. Some of those are going to be instructor-led. They can also be learner or student-led as well as they're going through it. To give you a little bit of a sense for what that looks like, this is sort of an example or sample schedule for an online course. And what we have in here are some components of simulation delivery along with other things that are not based on the simulation. So what we might do is start off with pre-course preparation that's happening, where the learners are by themselves. They're not engaged in the course directly, but instead what they're doing is they're reading about what it's going to be covered in the course. They're doing this individually on their own computers at home, and it's being done asynchronously. And they might spend a half an hour to an hour preparing for this course. From there would typically be some kind of introduction that's provided by the facilitator. This would be done in a web share typically, and all the participants in the workshop would participate in it. And that might last for an hour. And then maybe we have some non-simulation content, maybe a lecture on a topic which is it could be video based and it could be individual and asynchronous. So it doesn't necessarily mean that the facilitator is delivering it, although the facilitator could deliver it. And again, that might be a small chunk of 30 to 90 minutes. When the lecture is done, or when that lecture material is provided in some format in a video, either asynchronously or synchronously, From there, we'd go to maybe a Q&A, again, a synchronous component, maybe lasting 30 minutes to an hour, where the facilitator would answer questions that were covered in the lecture that was provided in the video that was done, again, individually. And all participants can ask questions about it. The facilitator can answer them. And this is the opportunity, if you're going to add simulation, to also spend a little time saying, hey, we're going to cover a simulation next. Let's talk a little bit about what that simulation is doing, answer some basic questions about it, and give the participants an opportunity to learn more around how that simulation is going to work. From there, in, say, some cases, we can do an individual asynchronous simulation and have the students or the learners play through it together. They would run that on their own over 40 minutes or an hour in another section in this, and then they would come together again for that simulation debrief and discussion. So there'd be another web share with all participants, and that would be synchronous and maybe last for an hour, where the facilitator debriefs the results from the simulation. And what you can see here is very different than a traditional in-person class. We're chunking this content, we're spreading it out, maybe spreading it out over multiple days, or kind of going back and forth in different modalities and things like that to help the learner and mix it up. We've seen some things that people have been attempting where they're doing 8, sometimes 16, sometimes 24 hours of content where they're expecting people to sit online. Really, that's too much to ask in this format of sitting, in front of your computer all that time. And this idea of mixing it up, using different modalities and things like that is going to be helpful. This is one example of a format that can be used. But the goal today with our webinar is to talk about a lot of different schedules, a lot of different ways of incorporating simulation into online learning. So what we want to cover is 3 different types of simulations. And we're going to talk about single-player turn-based simulations. The example that I just shared could be an example of how that would be incorporated into a class. Then we want to go to the multiplayer semi-asynchronous simulations, and finally this anonymous multiplayer synchronous simulations, and talk about sort of how each of those can be used in online classes and how they're used differently. So let's start with the single-player turn-based simulation. Here we have a classroom of what used to be done, right? So this is what we were all doing potentially even a few months ago that we are no longer doing. This is not practicing good social distancing here among the learners that are in this room, and this is a fairly big room of learners playing a simulation together. Or, actually in this case, they're playing individually. They're all looking at their screen independently, but they're sitting together, and then the facilitator can kind of debrief the simulation at the end. And what we're changing to is this format, right? So what we have now are learners who are by themselves at home running simulations, and they can play them fully independently. They don't need to be doing the actual play of the simulation live while everybody's on say a Zoom meeting like we are today, or some other format, going forward. Although that can be done as well. That's sort of an option, but there's alternative options that are available as well. We have a large number of all these simulations, but these are just some examples of single-player simulations that are in the Forio catalog. I'd like to point them out. The ones that are in bold here are ones that are pretty popular, and the other ones are reasonably popular too, but we see a lot of people playing, like, for example, the change management simulation is a frequently used one, data analytics, this is a design thinking simulation, and so forth. But my point is there's a lot of these style of single-player turn-based simulations that are available. And let's take a deeper look at how this type of simulation would run in a classroom for a setting up. And then what I'm going to do is take you through and show you precisely how this works, and even show you how this simulation like this, what it looks like. So again, we might start off with a lecture. This is outside of the simulation play. And then there would be a simulation prep. There would be an opportunity for the learners to, on their own, kind of read about what the simulation is about, and see some videos, for example, see other content that's available, and kind of prep for what's going on in the simulation, but get a broad sense of what they're going to be doing when they're running that simulation. From there, they would go to lecture and debrief, sort of explaining what the simulation is about, where the facilitator would explain a little bit about it. And again, this would be short. So what would typically happen is that the lecture and the simulation prep would be done together. That would be sort of an assignment that would be provided to the learners. And they would cover, this 15 minutes and this 30 minutes to an hour together as, content that they would be doing. And then when they finished that, they would gather together again. And then as part of there'd be a debrief, a Q&A piece on the lecture, but part of that discussion would also cover the introduction to the simulation, where the facilitator could then talk about, what they need to do and what questions any of the participants have. Then, asynchronously again, so where the learner finds their own time to decide when they're going to play the simulation, they would get together, they would work on their own and run the simulation asynchronously and individually. And usually they would spend on their own, something like 40 minutes to an hour playing it. This little indicator here indicates that the learner could also play it more than once. They could play it multiple times. And then the class, the workshop would come together again, and there would be a simulation debrief and discussion that would occur where everybody would get together, that we would, the facilitator would debrief the simulation, and the participants could share their results and their insights from the simulation, again, done synchronously here. So let's take a look at that and sort of show some examples. And I thought the place we could start off here to kind of understand more about this is, first off, just to go back and look at sort of what's available for single player synchronous simulation. So if you go to Foreo.com/store and you scroll down to player types, one of the types in here is single player. So what we're talking about are all these simulations, and there's a lot of them in here. There's sort of a lot and a wide variety of these that can run. And what I thought I'd do for an example today is go through one that's pretty popular. This is a strategic innovation simulation that was developed with Foreo and Harvard with Clay Christensen a few years ago, and we did a version 3 of this, I guess, a year or 2 years ago or so. What I'm going to do today is take a different approach than I usually do, which is to start off with the facilitator side. So this is, if you're running this simulation, this is what you'd see first in terms of the setup, and then I'll jump to what the learners would see as they're going through it. So here I'm in the simulation setup, and I'm going to go ahead and set up a new run. And I can see I've got a new run set up here. I could name my scenario if I wanted to. I can decide if I want a leaderboard or not. I can define how many times the learners get to repeat the simulation if they want to play it multiple times. And there's also different difficulty levels. So in this simulation, the basic level, you can never get fired and sort of easier to play. The intermediate level is you can't get fired if you lose a lot of money. And the advanced, it's relatively easy to get fired in the game. So we're going to go ahead and leave it at advanced for now. But this also illustrates sort of how this could be used multiple times in, say, a multi-day session where you're using simulation. Then we want to assign teams here. And when we're starting off, when we're going to, just to illustrate this again, this point where we want the learners to prep for the simulation. And what we're talking about here is, this piece here, right? So this simulation prep, where the learners are just going to log in, make sure that that login works, and they're going to learn a little bit about the simulation. We don't want them to actually play at this point. What we want to do is, talk to them first and then open the simulation for play. So that's kind of how we want this all to work here. All right. And so the way we can do that is by setting up this piece down here. We could say, open the simulation for play. Currently it's closed. We'll open it so it's prepare and tutorial only. And now it's in that mode, but it's not open to actual users for playing the sim. So if I go here and I log in as a user in this class, what you can see is I'm in the prepare mode. I've got the content that I can read about the simulation. I can look at the foreground reading, for example, kind of understand what the simulation is about. I can play through a tutorial that shows me the different screens that are available in the simulation, but I can't actually use these screens for playing it. This is going to lock me out of this ability to use these screens as I go forward. And that gives me a little bit of an opportunity to understand what's going on, but not launching me into actually playing the simulation. after I've given the opportunity for people to kind of understand what the simulation is about, and we've come together as a group and we've talked about what we're going to do during simulation, then we're ready to open the simulation to users. So now the simulation is open to users, and if I go back here, I can see that the simulation has changed now, where I can look at results here for the simulation, with on the dashboard, for example, see what's going on and start to play. And the nature of this style of simulation is that it's single player and turn-based. And so, we start off here in year 2 of 10. So there's multiple rounds that are going on in the simulation. What happens is I can make decisions around, in this case, it's about R&D or innovation investments. And so, I might do some allocation here in terms of how I'm going to be doing spending. And then I enter a strategy of what I'm going to do. I submit my decisions and I advance. So now I'm in the next year and I can see how I did and see if my strategy is working or not. Look at other screens that are on here, and then do another round. And as I advance, I get news and things like that. So this is a turn-based simulation that can be run by the learner completely independently, and they can find out. They sort of discover this and run it forward. And if they get fired in the simulation, which this particular simulation allows for, they can restart and play again. And there's sort of this opportunity in here for archived plays, which you can see a set of things for running this. And I can also start a new play when I want to. So that's what the learner experience looks like for this simulation. At the end of the simulation, what I see is something different. So what I'm going to do now is jump to a finished class. And the next part of this then, after everyone has played, is so we just completed the simulation play where 30, 50 people have gone through the simulation on their own and they played asynchronously, and now we're moving on to a simulation debrief and discussion, and we're coming back into a webinar like we have today, where all the participants are logged in, they've had this experience, and now we're going to debrief what happened during that experience with the learners. So I would come into it, I would go to class results, and I could start to talk about what sort of happened in the simulation. The facilitator has some advantages in running it online in this case, in that the facilitator can carefully review all the results from the simulation and prepare sort of what students you might want to call on and sort of what's going on. And one of the features of this particular simulation that's sort of interesting is notable plays. So, one of the things we might do is say, okay, we want to start a discussion where we talk about, different things that students did that sort of represent things that happen within the simulation. Like if someone had a scattered R&D strategy, for example, we'll say, well, it looks like this particular student did that or this learner did that. And what I can do is impersonate that student. And what I do is say, Sarah, what was your experience like for this run? Can you tell me a little bit about it? And then also say something like, would you mind if I shared your screens with the rest of the class? Sort of get that permission in advance, and then go back and look at what had happened when Sarah ran the simulation, what she experienced, and what the outcome was, and what worked and what didn't work about that particular strategy. Then we can go back and hit this in the lower left here, this return to facilitator. And then, look at other class results and choose other students to talk about other things that happened in the simulation. Use other people here for, in this case, a successful transition to a new technology or commitment to mature technology. So at this point, we're doing what would traditionally be done, in the classroom, but doing it online, and bringing this class back together to run the simulation this way. And we can see all the results. Again, sort of identifying in advance which ones we want to go through for debrief purposes. And besides just showing these pages that are in the simulation for the facilitators, we could also have debrief slides that are available, maybe videos, other content that we would typically see. Okay. This doesn't have to be done purely asynchronously. So another approach for these single-player turn-based simulations is to deliver them synchronously. So if you want to do a single workshop that comes together in a single time. Say, well, really, what I really like to do for this is to run it for 2 or 3 hours with a group and have them complete the entire simulation all at once. You can do that as well. And so here's sort of a structure for running this simulation as a synchronous play for single player turn-based simulation. We would start off with a lecture and debrief about the simulation. This would, of course, be all participants and synchronous. In this one, typically what would happen is the participants wouldn't necessarily log in to prepare in advance. Instead the facilitator would introduce the simulation, and then at the end of the introduction would provide the login information for accessing the simulation to the students. Or it could be provided in advance, but then the facilitator moves it from being in closed mode to open mode, so that we kind of keep everybody's attention, so they don't jump quickly to actually running the simulation while the introduction is going on. And then learners would play the simulation, but part of the play for the simulation would be that preparation that would be going on. So they'd be prepping first by kind of reading the introductory material and then playing. And what we see in those circumstances is that the students or the learners are going to spend a significant amount of time on that first set of decisions, and then the decisions will happen more rapidly. So, giving 40 minutes to an hour for students to play would be good, and that often let at least many of the students or the learners to complete more than one run of the simulation. And we can use the web share tools for answering questions while the simulation is going on, where people can raise their hands, or people can do Q&A like we have today in this tool, to find out what, to answer any questions they have as they're going along if they have any difficulties. And then they would come together again. You say, okay, we're going to stop play. And a way to stop play in the simulation is what I showed before, where you can actually go back and close that simulation, make it no longer available. And that sort of compels the learners who are playing the simulation to stop playing and then come back and hear this debrief and discussion, where the facilitator can go through and ask specific participants what they want to do, or what happened in the simulation and how it plays. So a different design of this style of simulation. Next, I want to cover multiplayer semi-asynchronous simulation. So a different style of simulation. And I think a lot of you use this. One of the most popular ones that we have in our own catalog is this Everest simulation. And I think a lot of people who are on this call today actually are people who have run Everest in-person workshops and are trying to figure out, like, what do I do now? How do I do this for an online event? And certainly a big part of what we want to cover today. But to kind of give you a flavor for what this looks like, this is sort of a scene from running a traditional multiplayer semi-asynchronous simulation, where there's a group of people that are playing in the same world. So what that means is that decisions that are made by individuals within this world will affect the results for the other players, right? Either in a competitive strategy simulation, or in the case of Everest, it's more of a collaborative game where people are working together. But the decisions that this person makes is going to influence the outcomes for the other players and all around here. So they need to either compete or collaborate, or both, in order to have to see their outcomes within the simulation. But again, we can't do this format anymore. We can't do it. So what we want to be able to do is to run this online. So the new structure for this, is to use, say in this case, a Zoom format or WebEx or one of these other web share tools that are available, where the players come together in their own group and run this as a team. Now, what's interesting about this, and this is getting to the point about the semi-asynchronous, is that these teams or these worlds don't need to be online at the same time. So this group of 5, if this were Everest, which is typically a 5-person game, can decide a time that they want to play together, and they would coordinate and find a time to play. This other group of 5 might have a different time that might be more convenient for them. So they can all work that out and play some point, say maybe over a 2 or 3 or 5 day period. And then a debrief would be scheduled, where the debrief, the faculty or the facilitators would come together again to talk about the results from the simulation in kind of the same way that we saw with the single player simulation. So learner teams within a world, within one of these groups here, need to be online at the same time, but all teams do not need to be online at the same time. So they can be independent if you want them to be. Here are some examples of multiplayer semi-asynchronous simulations. Again, I've mentioned Everest, but there's also this value proposition. It's a marketing simulation on surgical robotics. There's a finance simulation, M&A in wine country, where you have 3 competitors that sort of try to merge or acquire another company within the game. There's another finance simulation around a private equity deal, and there's this sort of larger Digistrat strategy simulation from Kellogg that's kind of, it can even be played over multiple days and things. So those are some examples of those. When you're setting up semi-asynchronous simulations, just a little bit of guidelines for handling this. You want to introduce and assign the simulation by email or at the end of a prior virtual session that you have. And that's going to be done fairly quickly. It would take 5 or 10 minutes typically. And then during that session, you want to, or via email, you want to announce student teams and send learners the names of the other players in their world and ask each team to coordinate and then find the 60 to 90 minutes to play the simulation together. Then the teams would play the simulation outside of the classroom. And a team, like as we said, a team does not have to be online. The learners within a team have to be online at the same time, but other teams do not have to be online at the same time in order to play it. And then there would be a debrief that would be done in class again. So this is sort of the structure of this style of simulation, where we would start off with simulation prep. There would be an introduction to the simulation where within a lecture, again, we would talk about what we're going to do and maybe show a video for that simulation. Then the teams coordinate, and we typically have one person on the team who's assigned to plan out, like who's responsible for figuring out like when this group can come together. And they would use a calendar and email to kind of organize that and determine when they're going to meet. And then there would be simulation team play where they play on their own, and then there would be another group discussion, a group debrief that would be happening sometime later that week, something like that. So let's take a look at what a multiplayer simulation looks like. I'm going to use Everest as my example today. We're going to start that off. And what I'd like to do is start off with this instructor preview again. I'm going to start off by looking at what a facilitator sees, what you would see when you're running a session like this. And here you can see a group of, I think, 27 or 28 students who are logged in. They're playing on different teams. When you're in here, you can see where they are. And so, if you've assigned this and you're running it over multiple days, one of the things that you can do as the facilitator is see if the learners have finished, if the teams have finished, and then if there's some problem, if you say, hey, it's Thursday and we're going to be talking about this tomorrow, you can kind of prod a team. You say, hey, I see you haven't run it yet, or make sure you're going to finish it today before our next discussion online, something like that. There's also in here the opportunity for managing users. And what we would do here is assign people to play together. And if you're working over a very large area, like sometimes these virtual sessions are done globally, one of the things you want to do is try to get people within the same time zones working together so it's easier for them to coordinate and kind of figure out how they're going to run the simulation together. And then what would happen is during a session is, each of these players would log in and play the simulation. So here I'm logged in as one of the players. There's a video that's available up front for they could start off. They can watch that on their own. And then, here we are logged in as a leader in the simulation. We can see the decisions that they can make in the game and where they are and things like that. This is for one player, but, we would also have other players who are logged in who have different roles. Let me quickly log into some of the other players here. And the way these simulations advance, let me go to who this. So this is the physician. You can see that in the upper left here. Here's the physician as the player. In this one, they get a background information about what they're supposed to do. And one of the things the physician can do is provide medical supplies to selected climbers if they're in the same place in the mountain. And here we can see everybody is at Camp 2 right now, and they're facing a specific challenge in here. The way that this can run kind of semi-asynchronously, because these are set up where the teams are going to advance the simulation to the end, in this case it advances 6 rounds, is the leader is sort of responsible for advancing the sim. So what I can do here as the leader, what I'm logged into right now, I can hit ascend to camp 3. That's what I'm going to do. And then I can click advance to the next day. What it's going to do here is it's going to offer me some advice because I haven't actually entered decisions for the other players, but it's going to say, do you really want to advance given that they haven't spoken, not everybody has submitted their decisions, so you want to get their decisions in before advancing. And part of the communication that's going on in this simulation is, among the teams, so they might be talking to each other, or they might be using the online chat, which is also available in here as a way of communicating. So they can either chat with the other players here, or they could use a Zoom or WebEx or similar technology for having an online discussion and do it kind of like what they would do across a round table or something like that in a traditional workshop that wasn't delivered online. So there's some challenges with this style of simulation in terms of getting it set up correctly. And I have some advice for kind of doing this here. It's going to help you as you do these kinds of online simulations. First, what we want to do is decide on a web share technology that all teams should use in advance. And typically that's the same web share technology that the facilitator is using, right? So, if we're using Zoom here, we're going to set it up where other people who are using Zoom can create their own groups, and they'll be able to run that together. And then, because we're also trying to organize play for individual teams, we can suggest, for example, calendaring tools or other kinds of coordination tools for those teams to self-organize. It's usually a good idea to leave plenty of space for the teams to reorganize if something falls apart, right? Right now, especially where there's a lot of chaos happening in the world and things, people will plan for a particular meeting and then there'll be no-shows. And so, what we suggest with that is that you get it set up and then you leave some time in the schedule where those people who weren't able to show up, they can reschedule the session within their own team, and they can finish it in time for the lecture to occur. So that's sort of a useful feature of that. And it's also something to communicate to those teams too, say, hey, if it turns out for some reason that you're unable to run at the time you said, make sure you leave time in your schedule so you can do a do-over if you need to. A key point here too for organizing this for the semi-asynchronous is to make one person per team responsible for setting things up. So if you kind of diffuse the responsibility among all the players, then there's sort of this problem of who's going to actually be responsible for setting it up. But you really want to say per team, there's one person, you say this person's responsible for coordinating calendars and determine when to run the simulation. So that person is supposed to send an email out to the other players in the team. And then they would also be responsible for hosting the web share for that team if that's the technology you're going to use. There's an important piece of this too for the facilitator is to coordinate and to be prepared to reassign players if people drop out or something in the middle of it. So if they lose somebody, then you can have it set up in a way where you can maybe reassign a new player or have people on standby to help play for those teams that need an extra person to participate. And this simulation style, in addition to be playing in the semi-asynchronous way that I've been describing so far, can also be played synchronously. So the synchronous play simulation would work kind of similarly to what we saw with the single player simulation. We'd start off with a lecture debrief from a lecture that happened before about the topic. There'd be a simulation introduction where we go through it together. And then there's the simulation prep and play where everybody's online playing the simulation at the same time, and a simulation debrief and discussion. So that could all happen together. And the best way to do that is to use a somewhat little known feature. It depends on who you are. Some of you probably use this all the time, and others of you have never heard of it, I imagine. But there's something on Zoom called breakout rooms, and in WebEx called breakout sessions, almost the same name. And on other tools too, there's this technology. There's sort of other, it's not just those two, but the one I'm most familiar with is Zoom because that's what Fourier uses. But there's this ability to have breakout rooms that allow individual teams or within a meeting within Zoom to meet separately and then come back together again. It's a little bit challenging for me to demonstrate this. I was trying to think of different ways of doing it. What I decided to do for today to kind of illustrate how this feature works is to run a short video from Zoom themselves that kind of explain breakout rooms. Is about 3 minutes long. So I thought I'd just do that today because it relates so closely to what we're talking about. So let's go ahead and give that a try. And I'm just going to play this. It's, like I said, it's about a 3-minute or so video that explains breakout rooms. And then we can talk a little bit about how that relates to simulations here at the end.
Hey everyone, Farah from Zoom here. On this brief video, we're going to show you how you can leverage our breakout room feature to take a large meeting or virtual classroom and split it up into smaller groups or sessions. You'll see that I have already enabled the breakout room feature, which you can find in your settings along the bottom. And that breakout room button will actually be right here. This is a button that only your hosts or co-hosts will be able to see. And right now we don't have a co-host in the session. If I manage my participants, I can hover over Catherine, for example, to make her a co-host. So she'll see this button now as well. When we're ready to split the group into smaller sessions, I can easily click this button to get a pop-up window asking me how many rooms I'd like to assign out and how many participants per room. For this example, it's recommending, since there are 6 people, we can split it up into 2 rooms. I can do this automatically or manually. So if we click on the automatic button, it'll generate those breakout rooms for us. Certainly if there's anyone I want to swap out, maybe I want to move Michael to the other room, I can exchange him for a different participant. Once I'm ready to open all rooms, I'll click this open all rooms button and our participants will be able to join the sessions that we've created for them. So we'll slowly see those people join. One thing that's really important to note is that as a host or a co-host, you can actually hop between the different rooms to talk to the participants. You can see here I have the join button. Now everybody's left to go to the rooms. I can broadcast a message to everybody and say, wrapping up in 1 minute. And this will broadcast the message. And then I can close the rooms, which gives them a 1-minute timer to rejoin our session. We'll give everybody a second to rejoin, and I'll show you 1 or 2 additional features with breakout rooms. There we go. We can kind of see everybody kind of popping back in. Now everybody's rejoined the main session. You'll see that I have the opportunity to reopen these rooms again, which is really great. If you have a very long session or a very long virtual class, you can split into these virtual smaller groups as often as you'd like. And the additional options here will allow you to automatically close breakout rooms after a specified amount of time. You can also change the countdown timer to be 30 seconds or 2 minutes if you like. I'll show you a setting where you can also pre-assign folks to be in your breakout room before the classroom starts. You'll want to navigate over to the class that's already been created in your Zoom portal. Under the Meetings tab, you can find your meeting. Scrolling all the way to the bottom, you'll see if we open this to re-edit it, I have the opportunity to pre-assign a breakout room here. And I can create the rooms and upload a CSV with all of my participants in advance so that their names are already populated in the room when I start the session. That's basically how you can run breakout rooms. We hope you found this video helpful.
Okay, so that explained breakout rooms. I really like that explanation of how they work, and I think the really critical feature in this is here. I just wanted to illustrate this again, where you can see the breakout room assignment. So what you would do is create a CSV file, which is typically a spreadsheet that would list out the different players, and you would want to coordinate the players that you have in your assigned for the worlds or the teams that you're in your class with these rooms. And then you would import them from the CSV, create the rooms in advance, but then after you've done so, you would still be able to kind of shift the players around if there's no shows and things like that that you need to deal with, in kind of the same way that you're probably used to doing for in-class sessions. And again, this is, I showed this today because I'm personally familiar with Zoom. I don't, and I think the Zoom technology works pretty well, but I know it's also available for other tools like, WebEx, for example, if that's what you're using for setting this up. And with that, then you're going to be able to do a synchronous multiplayer session pretty seamlessly. It's going to work, I think, pretty well if you use that kind of breakout room technology for setting it up. All right. So our last piece for today is to talk about anonymous multiplayer synchronous simulations. And this is sort of an interesting case, and there's several of these kinds of simulations that are available. There's the strategy simulation, negotiator's dilemma. There's a leveraging network simulation that's out there that's around how to build personal networks. There's a beer game, a root beer game. There's an interesting crisis management simulation called Cyber Attack. This one actually looks like it's around IT strategy, but it's really a generic crisis simulation. It's a pretty good simulation. I like this one a lot. And then there's a global collaboration simulation as well that has to do with how teams communicate across, when people speak different languages and things. And what's interesting about all of these simulations is that unlike the previous set where you want the teams kind of forming coherent teams in advance, in this one, what you really want is for people to not communicate with each other, at least not directly. Often that you want to restrict it so that the only communication that's happening is through the simulation. So there should be no kind of verbal direct communication among teams. And that actually in some ways makes the simulation easier to run. So let me illustrate an example of that as sort of my final example today. And what I'm going to do here is log in as a facilitator to this negotiation simulation. And let me go to the simulation setup here. And here you can see the setup for the simulation. Right now you can see there's 0 out of 3 players logged in. And unlike the other example that I just shared a moment ago, there's no pre-assigned teams in any of these simulations, these anonymous synchronous simulation, multiplayer simulation. So here we have, in my class, I've only set up 3 users to make it easy on myself. You can have either 3 or 4 users in this particular simulation. And what I can do then is go here and set up the other users. Let's do that. So here I'm going to log in as student 1. And you can see they're kind of in prepare mode. They can't do any of these other things right now in here. And now I'm going to log in as a second player for student 2 here. And they're also kind of in prepare mode right now. And then I'm going to go to student 3. This is the 3rd player that I've set up for my example of this kind of anonymous play. So now all 3 of them are logged in. And there, you can see up here in the upper left, it says waiting for simulation to begin. I'm going to then go to this screen. And now you can see over here, it says 3 out of 3 users are logged in. In a real class, you'd probably have 50 or 70 users or something like that. And you can see the number of people that were able to log in or able to access the simulation. Now that they're logged in, I want to auto-assign groups because in this case, what we want is to assign people to groups arbitrarily. We actually only want them communicating through the sim, and you'll see why in a minute. Again, this is a negotiation simulation in this case. So we've assigned groups. They're all assigned now, and then we can begin the run. So the run is beginning, and the game is going to start here in a second. I'm going to go over to player 1 here, and you can kind of see what's going on with this person. I'm going to go to player 2 and see where they are and things like that. And then the simulation is going to be available for play. So here you can see the countdown starting, where there's a number of seconds before the simulation begins. We'll give this a second here to get started. And then I'll play through a little bit of this so you can see a little bit about how this one works. So the idea here is that it's sort of a prisoner's dilemma style problem. It's called the negotiator's dilemma. You can decide to cooperate or compete. There's a cover story for it. And then let me go to the other one here. I'm going to cooperate. So 2 of them are cooperating, and then I'll have the 3rd player compete. Okay, so now we have the results for it, and we can see what happened here. The player that, for round 1 in terms of cooperation, kind of what happened with them in terms of their moves and things, and we can see the outcome, and then we can go back and do another round. And so it's happening round by round. And in the middle of this particular simulation, there's an opportunity for people to chat with each other and try to persuade the other players to cooperate with one another, and you can kind of see if they do it or not. So that's another option in this one. But the key point of this is that because they're not really forming coherent teams, they're talking to each other, they can run this simulation purely synchronously. And so that's sort of how this simulation will run, where what we do is we do a lecture debrief introducing the simulation. The students or the learners would prep and play, and this would all be done synchronously, and it would be anywhere from 30 minutes to an hour. And then after that event is over, there'd be a debrief and discussion. And for this style, for the anonymous synchronous play for multiplayer simulation, the only way to really run it is in a synchronous mode. So but because of the way that it's set up, there's no need for these breakout rooms or breakout sessions the way we saw in the synchronous mode for the semi-asynchronous play. All right, final considerations for doing online delivery of simulations. Well, first off, I want to talk about, you know, there's ways, oops, sorry. There's ways of sharing sound and video easily. And a lot of these things, what you sometimes want to do is be able to share video. Probably a lot of you are already familiar with this, but I wanted to point out, because this is important in many simulations to be able to share, you know, video clips, is there's tools, and most of these tools, I know they exist in Skype, for example. It also exists in Zoom, where you can optimize for either sharing the computer sound or a full screen video clip. And I just wanted to point that out, that that's an option here. Some people don't know about it, and they do kind of crazy things where they'll put like a microphone near the speaker on their computer to try to get it to play through or something like that. And, you know, that's sort of awkward. So this is a better solution for that, and the quality of the sound comes through that way. And that's actually what I used when I shared that video clip from Zoom about how to do the breakout rooms. So I just wanted to point out that feature in case you didn't know it. Probably a lot of you do, but just to make it clearer for folks. Few things just to keep in mind, again, just final consideration items. If you're new to teaching online or hesitant to teach via virtual classroom, you should start small. And what I'd suggest is doing only 1 or 2 simulations in a workshop or course, and then expand from there. And a key part of this is to practice using the simulation in advance. And you know, a big part of it is practicing is to play as the students, like to understand what that student or learner experience is going to be before trying it. That seems obvious, but believe it or not, I've seen many people who've tried running simulations without ever experiencing what the students see in advance. So it's a really important piece of it. Another sort of little trick, little technology trick that you can use, if you use Chrome, and you saw me do this today, there is this people feature, and I use this all the time for multiplayer games to test them. So what you saw me do here is within Chrome, you have people, and you can set up additional people by adding them if you haven't done it before. And what it allows you to do is to have completely independent sessions as if they were completely different browsers per person. And that way, if you're doing a 5-person game, you can actually set up 5 different sort of instances of your browser and then enter the decisions for each of the players and kind of move through it yourself. And another way to do this, of course, is to get some colleagues to join you and to test the simulation together. And that, you know, actually makes it sort of a more realistic experience. But this way kind of provides a way to test the simulation on your own if you want to do that and kind of understand how everything works. We're facing a design moment right now as facilitators, right? And now is a great time to become a learner again. So look at the skills that are going to help you become a great learner and apply them online. And I think an important piece of this is, you know, we've been scrambling, a lot of people have been scrambling over the last couple of weeks here. You know, you know, there's all kinds of calls that are coming in and things like that around how to deal with this. I think it's important to give yourself a break if you can, and think about how the design of a course is going to work that's going to feel interactive and engaging for the learners when you're doing it online. And then in addition to practicing as a student or as a learner, also practice as a facilitator. So do a full run through with 2 or more users if you're doing a multiplayer simulation. Even if you're doing a single player, it's useful to have more than 1 user before you run that first simulation event. And you know, there's an opportunity here. It's, you know, to turn online delivery into an opportunity to get it to work for everyone. And in some ways, you know, maybe have a better experience than they would have had in a classroom. That's what I wanted to cover for today. And I don't see a lot of questions right now in the Q&A piece. But it sounded like some people had some problems with the screen being blurred and things like that. I know some of the web share technologies are getting maxed out, so that may be an issue for today for some folks. If you're interested in exploring more, there are other webinars that are available that talk more about specific simulations, so feel free to email us if you want to know about some specific simulations or some examples of some of the things I've shared today. And the best way to reach us is at info, I-N-F-O, @foria.com. All right, I'm going to wrap it up for the day. Thank you very much for your time, and good luck converting your in-person simulations to online. Bye-bye.